All right. Hey, good afternoon, folks. Once again, we are back taking a look at the tropics. Today is Friday, October 11th, 2024. This is your morning tropical update. We are resetting after Milton. We are looking at the Atlantic basin and what is out there for threats and interests. Of course, people are still kind of concerned about the Western Caribbean. We'll talk about that system again today, see what's new on that. Overall, though, the Atlantic basin is going a little bit quieter overall for the next couple of days. We had a couple of features here to talk about. This is post-tropical storm Milton. Has been pretty much fully absorbed by a frontal system. We can see a strong cold front evidenced by these cloud streets moving off the coast of the New England and mid-Atlantic areas. That indicates that cold, dry air is moving offshore associated with a cold front. We can see that air spilling all the way down into Florida where much cooler temperatures have been observed. So that's good news for folks that are out of power. At least you guys aren't roasting down there as cleanup efforts begin. That'll usher in mostly dry and cooler conditions, especially overnight. Bermuda is getting some weather from Milton's leftovers as it passes by, but this is no longer a tropical system and no longer a major threat. Also in the Atlantic basin, we have tiny little tropical storm Leslie. All the convection with Leslie got sheared away, so poor thing is on its last legs, and this whole mess of ex-Milton is going to come scoop her up and take her out to sea with him. So both these systems moving away, no threat to the Atlantic anymore. In terms of active storms today, otherwise, we do have Invest 94L near the Cabo Verde Islands. This system is trying to find a very small window to get developed. It's going to run into some much more unfavorable conditions and background shear and drier air over the next couple of days, but the wave is generally going to move to the west. Now, we don't think it's going to develop. If it does develop, it'll have a very short window, and then it'll pretty much die off across the actual central Atlantic for much of its journey. May have to watch it down the road, but no major threats. And again, a long way to go on that one. So I'll show you some of those graphics and then we'll talk about the Caribbean. So again, Hurricane Center's map to kind of verify everything. They put on a special update this morning for this Invest and gave it a 50% shot, but they note that by Saturday, conditions are expected to become less conductive. So if this were to form and steal Nadine off the list, it may do so, but it would only be a storm for probably a day or two, and then it likely would degenerate back into a tropical low as it moved off to the west. Again, Leslie, just for situational awareness, again, moving off quickly to the northeast and is curving away from the U.S. No threat at all. The ensembles with 94L do kind of look a little scary. If you look at this, you go, well, I mean, that shows it coming to the Caribbean, and, you know, I know it's just beyond the Caribbean, but we can see here that much of the ensembles do not develop this. They have it less than 30 knots, which is basically below like tropical depression strength, you know. So it doesn't look like that. Although this wave, or the skeleton or the ghost of the wave, will move westward. No development chances the next couple of days, you know. Down the road, maybe, but we'll talk about that by the end of the video. So that leaves us pretty much with our Caribbean system. So we'll go ahead and talk about that. So the trends today have been good on the GFS. It's kind of the same thing we talked about yesterday. So what we generally have is, you know, this Caribbean system everybody's kind of freaking out about is a very common pattern this time of year. The Western Caribbean is one of the hot spots for formation in October. This is where the warmest, deepest water is left, and oftentimes where the most tropical forcing is left. So what typically starts to happen, and this is happening this year, is when we start getting October cold fronts and strong high pressure systems sit over the eastern U.S., you have what you call the ridge over troubled water patterns, which is higher pressure is somewhere, which means lower pressure has to be somewhere else. Very basic meteorology thing. If the pressure is really high one place, it's going to be lower somewhere else. The entropy and, you know, the whole thing, right? So what typically happens is pressures begin to lower in the Western Caribbean. And oftentimes what you have is a bit of a frontal boundary kind of stretched out here, where you have the cooler, drier air stretched out across the Western Atlantic. And then this kind of puts a little tail end of the frontal boundary down here over warm water and over what is typically going to be lighter wind shear, because when you have a high pressure ridge set up in the upper levels, you typically have lower shear down here. If you had a trough down here and then you had a bunch of wind shear, it would be a different story, but you don't. So you kind of have some favorable winds, you have favorable background rotation, you have favorable moisture, and you have favorable water temperatures. It's a very, very common pattern that we see in October. Oftentimes Central America and Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula get hammered this time of year by hurricanes late in the season if this pattern sets up like it does. Now in October is where the cold fronts don't really show up and they're late getting here. It doesn't really happen. happen, but in October's like this, where we expect multiple strong cold fronts to come through over the next week or two, this is something we'll have to watch. So yes, the GFS is talking about it, and no, I'm not going to treat you guys like you're 5 and go, oh, don't look at it, it's nothing to worry about. Like we're going to go in the middle and say, hey, this is what's going on, and we're going to explain it, right? So GFS has been pretty well signaling some background rotation. So kind of weaker, broader, messier kind of rotation with moisture and whatnot going into the middle of next week. This is when that second strong cold front comes in. We have the one cold front this weekend. That's kind of a lighter cold front. That's going to kind of, sit along the Gulf Coast in Florida going into early next week. But then after like Columbus Day or whatever we call it now, this cold front, this much stronger cold front comes in, and associated low spins up over the Carolinas and moves off, and this is going to really send that colder air surging back down, and this will be a significant fall cold front blast for the U.S. I mean, we're talking like 40s into the middle of Florida cold, so this will be a very chilly air mass that moves in, very strong Canadian high pressure with very, very dry air moving in. And this will probably help kick off the cyclogenesis down here, because you guys can see the frontal boundary on the 700, 300 here over here on tropical tidbits. There's a very sharp cold front, and at the tail end of that cold front, you have low pressure developing again over warmer water, lighter shear, and heavy tropical moisture. So this, though, means that what we're looking at is probably a better chance for this to move off to the west. This is actually, that was actually yesterday's 12Z. Sorry, I was looking at some older models. So same thing happens. Same thing happens here. So the front comes down on Wednesday into Thursday, and then you can see by Friday morning, you've got our frontal boundary and you've got our system down to the south of the frontal boundary. Now, what have the trends been? Well, the trends have actually been more towards Central America. The latest GFS run takes a significant hurricane into the coast of like Belize and just south of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula and some of the states down here, or the countries down here. And this has been the trend for the last 2 or 3 runs. If I go back to some other runs from the last 4 or 5 runs, the GFS has been correcting down from the Yucatan and then maybe even into the Gulf down to here. Now, if this storm were to form down here and move into Central America, it would be very unlikely to impact the U.S. Sometimes moisture can wrap back around and eventually try to redevelop into something, but it's usually like a weak, like a rainmaker type thing. If this were to bury itself in Central America, it would pretty much be over. Now, the Yucatan's a bit of a different story. If we go back to that run where it comes into the northern Yucatan, it can cross the Yucatan and get back into the Gulf as a messier storm, but that doesn't mean that it's dead. But the point here is that this is all happening on Sunday, October 20th. We are talking about 11 days from now. So, I mean, if we step back on the timeline, just to get everybody aware here. So this is tomorrow morning, cool, dry, high pressure across the Gulf Coast in Florida, nothing going on. We go into Sunday, not much going on. Monday, Tuesday, we're even into Wednesday morning now, and this is when the secondary strong cold front shows up, that reinforced shot of dry air that brings even cooler, drier air to the East Coast and Florida and much cooler weather. And then the frontal boundary moves across the Gulf Coast, and again, this creates a lot of background forcing down here where higher pressure up here, lower pressure has to be somewhere else, and then this is what spawns off the storm. GFS has this pretty well, and it spawns into a pretty strong hurricane. 950 is definitely like Cat 2, Cat 3 status, and then moves this into Central America, because as we look at, the high is pretty expansive going into Saturday and Sunday, and the ridge really pushes us to the south. Now, that's been a trend correction from the previous GFS runs, where the GFS has been showing that high more offshore and that high a bit further, more progressive by Sunday, which would mean that it would have some window to come northward. But the correction has been for a stronger, more sprawling high pressure in these last few runs, which keeps us down into Central America. It doesn't let it lift northward. So that's kind of that's what the trends are looking like. I don't want to say that it's definitely set in stone. Some GFS members do still pull this up into the Gulf of Mexico, and we would have to watch it. There's also some worlds where this actually curves more back towards Cuba and maybe grazes South Florida. Those are common tracks this time of year. A lot of infamous storms like the Cuba hurricane did that. So there's still other worlds where this is an issue. But I mean, if this is what the upper air pattern looks like going into Sunday, Monday of this weekend, very unlikely we're going to have to worry about this across the eastern U.S. Again, I don't want to say no, but something to watch. And again, you can see this on this model too, all that big red ridge right here. And then this is going to have to only go to the west. It can't go. There's nowhere else for the hurricane to go. So bit of good news there. But again, some of the GFS members are showing some members are still getting this up more towards the Yucatan. So if it starts moving more northward, then we would have to watch it, because eventually if it gets into the Gulf, there's nothing but land. It has to go somewhere into land, so we would be watching from there. But there's also a lot of dry air, shear, things like that. So, GFS and Euro also suggesting that in that like 10 to 15 day time frame, we may have to watch the wave that we were talking about earlier, 94L, as it moves across the Atlantic. It might have some window here, but the signal's still weak for now. If we look at the last thing we'll look at today, which is the overall background pattern as we work into the second half of October, we're going to look at the MJO and the Kelvin wave anomalies along with the upper air anomalies. And this is a very, very confusing graphic. People don't really know what this is. The MJO broad scale is just a large scale forcing of convective activity around the globe. And this is a big thing that moves in the upper levels of the atmosphere. And essentially it helps or suppresses thunderstorm activity globally. So what we've been in is a favorable phase of the MJO in phases 1 and 2 and 3, which is what forces some extra help. That's what's kind of been forcing these Nadine, or not Nadine, Helene and Milton kind of were benefiting from a favorable MJO index. But this is all rotating towards phases 4, 5, and 6 as we work through a lot of the end of October. And by the middle of the month, we'll be in a bit more of a suppressive phase in the MJO. So we don't expect a lot of help from that. And that doesn't rotate back around until towards the end of October, where we get back into phases 7 and 8, which become more favorable. And if we look at the Kelvin wave anomalies here from Mike Ventress's website, we see that there is a weak signal for a Kelvin wave passage around our area for the next week or so, but not much. And then the background anomalies at 80 West essentially are about neutral. So there's some Kelvin wave forcing and pretty much neutral upper air convergence / divergence, which means that this storm will have some favorability, but it will not probably benefit from the enhanced favorability that we saw with Helene and Milton. So factoring all that in, I think that it is prudent that, yes, a tropical system is likely to develop towards the end of next week down in the Caribbean, but signals right now are moving more towards a Central American landfall. And if that were to happen, it would not be a big threat to the eastern U.S. And other than that, we'll just have to watch other waves as it moves across. But the bottom line is we have at least about another 5 to 7 days of good weather and cool weather and nice weather to not have to worry about this stuff. And that if trends move back and we have something to watch, we'll track it from there. But as it stands right now, it's looking pretty good. So what I got for you guys today on your tropical update. I will probably not cover this as much over the weekend, but we'll still have posts on the page. And, if things start changing or developing back towards a threat, of course, we'll start talking about it again. So what I got for you guys today, as always, thanks for watching and have a good one.